it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. I investigate disturbing cases. Here are my stories. Episode 4, Hammerhead. Usually I start these stories off with some kind of message about police work. But today, all I have for you is this. Life is a bastard. It was a rainy October evening and I'd recently moved into my department's homicide division after a long hiatus. It was a department I was familiar with and initially loved being a part of. However, in light of certain events, I felt that I needed to leave for the sake of my own mental health. That being said, after a few years of investigating some of the most disturbing cases known to man, oddly, murder became somewhat benign. But more than that, I know it would provide a distraction. Personally, I was far past the point where I'd rather have my thoughts consumed by How to Catch a Killer than the growing number of monsters that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. As I pulled up to the apartment complex, I remember thinking to myself how odd it was that a place teeming with life could be so focused on death. The way people moved in and around the scene was like an ant colony, each individual doing their job independently of others. Yet the collective end goal remained the same. Find out exactly what happened and who'd done it. I had hoped that being as late as it was, we'd have fewer prying eyes. But as I looked around, I found the presence of the morbidly curious tenants was apparent, and it was understandable. People don't see murder every day. They're scared, curious, and fascinated all at the same time. It's an event so divergent from most people's normal that it's difficult not to look at. But still, part of me wishes they'd stay inside and save themselves from the trauma that will undoubtedly rise up later. Seeing a dead body is something that never goes away. I scanned the crowd of police and forensics people, looking for a familiar face. Luckily, it only took a moment for me to find it, and he smiled and waved as I approached. Officer Ryan stood among a couple of other patrol officers wearing his trademark smile. Few scars remained from his encounter with the hermit, and his once crooked nose had been repaired to look brand new. Detective Smith, what's up, man? He asked as I approached. Nothing much, I suppose, I replied with a yawn. Mostly just tired since apparently people can kill during regular working hours. The officer next to Ryan looked at me for a moment, puzzled before blurting out. Smith, you're back in homicide. I thought you were done with it after what happened. I responded with a nervous laugh. Just a little break, Officer Bailey. I was always coming back. I looked past him for a moment to take a look at the body. What do we have on the Vic? Officer Ryan sighed and shook his head, motioning for me to follow him. We made the short walk over to the body. Calling it a bloody mess would have been an understatement. The man's entire face and chest were caved in. Large pieces of flesh had been torn out from his neck, and it appeared as though his right arm had been smashed on the pavement. The way the body had been mutilated disturbed me to the core, and it was hard not to gag at the sight of the man. So, Officer Ryan began, as you can tell, we've got severe blunt force trauma. Cuts and bruises consistent with a fight. So far, no one we've spoken to has seen anything. We have the 911 caller waiting to talk to you, though. After getting the rundown, I went to inspect the body more closely. As previously mentioned, we were looking at an inordinately brutal attack. Thinking aloud, there seemed to be only one logical conclusion. This has to be personal. No way anyone desecrates a body like this if he was killed by a stranger. Unless they didn't want him to be identified. But even then, it's excessive. Maybe he had something of value, Officer Ryan added. Gets into an argument with someone trying to take his stuff, and they do this to throw us off? Well, I wasn't convinced. As I went to check his pants pockets, my suspicions were seemingly confirmed. I don't think so. His wallet and keys are still here, so it likely rules out a robbery. Opening his wallet, I found an ID belonging to that of Mr. Ernie Garrison, 58 years old. We'd still need someone to positively identify the body, but we could now very likely give a face to the guy. I called for an evidence collector to come over and take the items away while I continued to search the body. When I went to look at his neck and trapezius, my eyes grew wide, and I immediately yelled for the crime scene photographer to come and take a look. Embedded into the man's flesh were 3 yellow teeth. The man I presumed to be Mr. Bennett was only dead for an hour at most, yet the skin and muscle around the teeth were already rotting away. The look on his face mirrored mine, pure disgust mixed with confusion. Though neither of us had a deep understanding of biology or the human body, we understood enough to know that it doesn't rot that quickly, nor should it only rot in one place while the rest of it remained pristine. Already I was getting the vibe of something deeply wrong. Preliminary thoughts were coming together in my mind that I wanted no parts of. Ideas of just what the hell could have done this froze me for a second. Could the tall woman have brutalized this person, or something else? Once I regained my composure, I simply noted to my team that we needed those teeth removed and checked with forensics to see if they matched any DNA we had on file. Just as I'm about done with the body, I hear a faint buzz. I instinctively go and check my phone, but realize it's not me. It takes a second to locate where the sound came from, but I eventually spotted a soft blue light emanating from a nearby trash bin. Walking over, I discover a phone, and immediately I notice flecks of blood on the case. Pressing the home button takes me to a background image of a man who strongly resembled a slightly younger Roger Garrison and a dog. One missed call headlined the notification bar. A quick swipe not only shows me that Mr. Garrison doesn't keep a passcode, but he also has a text message from someone saved as asshole. Asshole, I said to myself. What are the odds that it's mere coincidence that he's in contact with someone he obviously has a problem with at the same time he gets killed? I walked the phone over to another evidence collector and told her to keep it safe and sound for me back at the station. After making the rounds and talking to the other detectives about what I'd found, it was time to speak with a 911 caller, Miss Eva Brownstein. I found her waiting outside her apartment door. I introduced myself and started off by asking her what the original 911 call was about. The tremble in her voice indicated she was still trying to deal with the stress. I was watching TV when I heard a loud noise outside. I think it was banging. I guess I assumed that one of the downstairs neighbors was doing some work or something. I know it's late and it seemed odd, but I wanted to mind my own business. The banging went on for a bit, and I'm sure Ernie had gotten sick of it, poor man. She shook her head. I hear him yelling that he was going to kick someone's you-know-what and slam his door. Next thing I know, sounds like there's a struggle outside. He's screaming cuss words at the top of his lungs and telling someone to get off of him. And that's when I called the police. But after I got off the phone, it was just silence. Did you happen to poke your head out and see anything? I asked. She nodded. When things got quiet, I peeked out of my window and saw Ernie's body lying there with blood all over it. No one around him. And you didn't go out to check if he was still alive? Son, I'm 74 years old and grew up in Brooklyn. If there's a dead body outside, the last thing you do is go hang around it. Well, I couldn't argue that. Did you happen to know who we went to confront, at least? Did you happen to know of anyone who'd do this to Ernie? She thought for a moment, but ultimately shook her head. No, I'm not sure who Ernie was going to see. I know he had a problem with one of the neighbors, but he never told me who they were. As for who would do this, no one I can think of. Ernie had a bit of a temper on him, sure, but overall he's a good guy. Outside of that one neighbor, he's never mentioned having any real problems with anyone. Are there friends or family we could ask? No kids, wife, or siblings. His parents died years ago. Well, I'm one of the few people he talks to, if there's even anyone else. Not that I wanted to call her a liar, but it was difficult to believe that a man who seemingly has no ties was brutally killed in that fashion. But between the phone, teeth, and the lead on the neighbor, I felt we actually had a pretty solid base to investigate. As I wrapped up the interview, she made one final off comment. I know Ernie was a fighter. He always used to carry a golden pocket knife with his initials inscribed on it. When you find who did this, I swear to God they'll have scars from that. When I finally got back to the station, the first thing I wanted to see was that phone. I nearly flew to Evidence to retrieve the device, and I was giddy as a kid on Christmas morning when I got the chance to see its contents. A couple of the other detectives and Officer Ryan crowded around my desk as I read what appeared to be a heated argument between him and his neighbor, Alan Wong. In short, they seemed to be arguing about the loud banging. Mr. Wong seemed to claim that he wasn't making the noise and urged Mr. Garrison not to investigate. The two had a continual back and forth, which eventually led to Mr. Garrison going out to confront whoever was outside, which led us here. Now this was critical. The lab wouldn't have DNA results back to us for a while, but we likely had a direct witness to whoever killed Mr. Garrison. If we could pinpoint who was outside at the time, then the DNA would be just icing on the cake. Either way, this all hinged on the testimony of Alan Wong. Well, finding his apartment once we had the name wasn't hard. Neither was getting him to agree to talk after politely informing him that if he was withholding information pertaining to an active murder case, he'd be in deep shit. It took a short ride downtown for me to begin sizing him up in the interrogation room. There were no cuts or bruises on his body, no flecks of blood either. For a murder that brutal, you'd absolutely expect there to be signs, but one thing was apparent. Mr. Wong was nervous. Even if he wasn't the perpetrator, he knew something. Beads of sweat were forming on his brow, and his eyes seemed bugged out, darting back and forth as if he was looking for something. "How are you doing today, Mr. Wong?" I asked, attempting to break the tension. He gave a nervous laugh. "Wild question to ask, considering the circumstances. Can we just get to it?" "Fair enough. Suppose the first thing I'd like to know is, how do you know Ernie Garrison?" "I fix things. One day he asked me to help fix up his car because he thought I'd be cheaper than a regular handyman." "Okay, so, you helped him out. And what? Everything was cool between you two? Do you ever speak again after that, or?" He shrugged. "I mean, there was a little dispute, I guess you could say. Nothing major, though. A man ends up dead after a dispute with a neighbor. An unfortunate yet classic storyline. The pieces were starting to add up in my head. And, what was this dispute over?" "Payment for my services. I'm a fair guy, but he was lowballing me on price. I tried to give him something below what he'd pay elsewhere, but that wasn't good enough. Just because the guy's my neighbor doesn't mean I'm going to work for free, you know? Well, after threatening to take him to court, he pays up. But he starts complaining about everything. Noise, my dog. He said he thought he smelled drugs from my apartment. Just a lot of shit. The guy was trying hard to get me kicked out." Sounds rough. You must have hated the guy." Hate's a strong word. Well, we weren't friends, but I never wished anything bad on him. It was just stupid." "Hey man, I get it. That's fair. Well, the problem here, of course, is that man ended up dead. So what I want you to do is tell me in your own words what you think happened." Well, the shift in demeanor was quick. I could hear his foot tapping rapidly now, and he choked up a bit when he spoke. I have no idea. I just know the dude got killed. Oh, it's sad as hell, but I don't have much to add." "Bullshit. That's odd, Mr. Wong, because we know that you were the last person to communicate with Mr. Garrison, and that he went to your place to speak with you. Add the fact that you two had clear problems, and surely this points to more than a coincidence." Even though he shook his head, I could tell from the look on his face that he wanted to say something more. "Look, Alan, I'm going to be frank with you. I already told you that if you're holding back information, you need to talk to us. Right now, you could be facing murder charges if this comes back to you. You could either have me tell the prosecutor that you were honest, or that you tried to hide shit the entire way. What's it gonna be?" He scoffed and slammed his hand on the table before pointing a finger towards me. "Don't do that. I didn't have anything to do with his death. You think I don't know how serious this is?" He let out a loud groan and put his hands to his head as tears started to form in his eyes. "This is so fucked. If I'm being looked at as a murder suspect, the last thing I want to do is tell the truth and look ridiculous." He was starting to panic. I took it as my cue to stand up and let him have some time to think. As I walked out the door, I turned around and let him know to just give me his truth, however ridiculous it sounded. After 20 minutes by himself, he was ready to talk. I'd hoped for a confession, hopefully some story about how anger led him and an accomplice to murder. Horrible but easy, open and shut. What I got, however, was so much more disturbing. Mr. Wong went on to spin a story about how he was out late at night throwing his trash away when he spotted something he'd only referred to as an abomination across the street. Apparently, as soon as they made eye contact, this abomination came for him, and his only option was to run inside and hide. You could hear the boom, boom, boom as this thing tried to break away at the door. Mr. Garrison had apparently heard the noise and thought it was Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong attempted to convince him to stay inside and stay away. Still, Mr. Garrison wasn't having it, and subsequently ends up dead. Well, that's why Mr. Wong didn't simply tell Mr. Garrison about the creature. He merely laughed and said, "You think he would have believed that? I wouldn't expect the person that trusted me most in the world to believe it, let alone someone who obviously hates me. He would have come down regardless." Well, it was indeed a ridiculous story, one that I'm damn sure nearly everyone outside watching the interview was laughing at. An abomination coming from the darkness attacked him. Yeah, right. Except, yeah, right. The way he spoke about what he saw and the genuine fear in his eyes as he flashed back to the memories was familiar. I was familiar with that demeanor because I'd experienced that exact same thing personally. Our conversation continued for a while after that, but I ended up letting him go. I informed him that I'd stay in touch, but deep down I knew I'd never see him again because he simply wasn't our guy. I don't know if it was for my own mental well-being or respect for due process, but I needed to hold on to the idea that this wasn't another hellspawn that came to wreak havoc on society. I needed to see this through and make sure I wasn't dealing with the standard type of darkness we see from human beings. For all intents and purposes, Mr. Wong didn't know what he saw, and this could easily be the work of some local maniac. It took some weeks, but when the DNA profiling came back on the teeth and other pieces of evidence we collected, things started to look bleak. Not a single match. Simultaneously, as we did further research into Mr. Wong, we found no traces of his DNA at the scene. Nor did we find any evidence that he'd been communicating with a third party to set up some kind of hitman job. Furthermore, searches from his home computer at the time of the 911 call indicate he was inside using his desktop around the time of the murder. Even potential security camera footage from the area turned up nothing. If Mr. Wong was involved, there wasn't any hard evidence to show it. Our two best leads were drying up, and over time Mr. Garrison's case went the way of many murders before it. Cold. The days went by, and with no new leads, we had to try something new. I convinced the chief to hold a press conference and ask the public for any info. The hope was that if someone recognized the types of injury, or Ernie Garrison himself, perhaps they could plug some holes we'd been missing. The tips that came in at first were of little to no help. They were primarily people suggesting completely random names. Maybe a creepy uncle or ex-boyfriend. Hell, we even got a few suggestions that a bizarre set of stairs off in the woods or skinwalkers were to blame. Honestly, I don't know what to make of either of those. I've heard stories of both, and to put it simply, no, I'm staying far away from both of those things. The point being, we weren't getting anywhere new. just wasting time chasing dead ends, at least until I heard a familiar voice on the phone one late office night. She sounded nervous about speaking at first. "Hello? Is this Detective Smith?" "Yeah, speaking, and who is this?" "I never gave you a name when we spoke last, but this is Maria Alvarez, nurse at the old hospital. We talked in the parking lot after... what happened?" The words old hospital brought back a flood of memories that made me shudder. The face of the hermit flashed in my mind, and I reflectively turned towards an air vent above me just to make sure nothing was hiding inside it. "Yeah, I remember you, of course. How are you, Miss Alvarez?" She let out a sigh. "I'm managing. What you said to me back then, it's been on my mind a lot lately, and it's given me a different perspective. I don't know, I just feel like the world has become a much scarier place almost overnight." Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, truly." "Well, it's okay, or at least tolerable. Well, I saw your press conference, by the way. It just brought up some thoughts, A lot of thinking about what could have happened to that poor man. And yet, the more I thought, the more I realized I may have an idea." "An idea of what?" She went silent for a moment, but I could hear movement on the other end. Then a hushed whisper came through. "Technically, I'm not supposed to be sharing this with anyone because of, patient confidentiality. So, a while back, someone came in with similar injuries at night. Bite marks with rotted skin around the injury site and severe head and chest trauma. We tried to ask him what happened, but all he'd say is some animal jumped him in the woods." I remember us all thinking how weird it was, considering the bite marks looked human. Well, after our conversation about how real monsters exist, I started to connect some dots. Maybe he was attacked by something similar and he didn't feel comfortable speaking on it. A potential pattern was forming, and my mind was eager to put the pieces together. "And, he's alive? What's his name, and where could I find him?" "Yeah, his name's Leonard Houston. I can send you some of his details, and maybe he'll be willing to shed some light on what happened." Bingo. We finally had a solid direction. I was eager to go and meet Mr. Houston to break this thing wide open. "I'd very much appreciate this, Ms. Alvarez, but before I go, can I just ask, why take this risk? Why not just leave it alone?" Dunno. I guess because you shared the truth with me, and I felt like I owed some truth back to you." Well, that was good enough for me. I finished the convo by letting her know that if she needed anything, even just someone to talk to when the dark thoughts creep in, I'd be right here for her, always. The next move was to bring someone along to meet this guy. I would have had another detective accompany me under normal circumstances, but this was far from normal. Of all the people I trusted to help me deal with the abnormal, one name was at the top of my list. Officer Ryan was ecstatic to get the call. Once we had our info on the guy, we immediately set out to find him. Well, the mood on the way over was jovial. Here we were investigating a murder, a ruthless one at that, and the two of us couldn't stop laughing. Well, as I've mentioned before, Ryan had that impact on everyone he came into contact with. I was certainly feeling the stress of finding the person or thing responsible for Ernie Garrison's death. Yet, all I wanted to talk to him about on the way over was what anime he was watching and whether or not aliens had visited Earth. Over the years, I've come to attribute many great things to Ryan, but the one thing that sticks out is the centering effect he had on me. Hell, all people. Without him, there's no doubt I would have gone insane by now. I found myself uncharacteristically calm when we pulled up to the run-down apartment. Despite the apparent sound of television inside, we had to knock a few times before we heard any movement. Eventually we decided to say, "Screw it," and yell "Police" to get his attention. The pale, skinny man that opened the door was quite obviously not thrilled to see us. He smelled of cigarettes and beer cans littered his couch. "Whatever y'all are saying I did, I didn't do it because I was busy that night," he said, throwing his hands up. I cleared my throat. Is Leonard Houston home? Hey, speaking. I took a quick peek behind him and saw he was alone. Right, well, good. Mr. Houston, you're not in any trouble. I'm Detective Smith, and this is my partner, Officer Ryan. We're looking into something, and we thought you might be of some assistance. He scoffed. Boy, do I look like a snitch to you? Not a snitch, Officer Ryan interjected. If anything, you'd be a hero. Something awful happened, and we figured you could help us right or wrong. Well, Mr. Houston thought for a moment before inviting us in. He offered us a place to sit on the couch, but between the beer cans and potential mold spots, we both opted to stand. So, I began. I heard from a reliable source that you were in the hospital a while back with some pretty gnarly injuries. What was all that about? Who told you all that? I mean, yeah, I got hurt pretty bad while going on a night hike. Some animal or something. Probably a coyote with mange. A coyote with mange that had human-shaped teeth and rotted the skin where it bit you. He shrugged and lit up a cigarette. I guess so. A lot of weird shit out there in them woods. I turned towards Officer Ryan and saw him reflecting my unamused look. Turning back to Leonard Houston, my tone turned a bit more serious. A man is dead, Mr. Houston. If you saw something that could help us figure out who or what did it, then I need you to be more honest than saying it was a coyote with mange. His demeanor shifted quickly, and underlying stress snapped to the surface. You're in my house. If I said I ain't seen nothing but a coyote, then I ain't seen nothing, okay? But that's not the truth, I fired back. You know it's not. Trust me, I understand what you saw was probably strange, but we really need your help on this. Well, maybe the truth ain't for telling. I'm gonna be honest with you, sir. I've seen shit in my life, but that day I realized there are some things better left good and forgotten. No sense in trying to convince anyone that it wasn't nothing but a mangy coyote. So, that's what it was. I'm sorry I couldn't help y'all, but it's all I got. I gave Officer Ryan another look. This time he knew what it meant. I was imploring him to do his thing. On cue, he walked over and put a hand on Mr. Houston's shoulder, pointed to a picture on the wall and asked, "That your daughter, man?" He nodded in response. "Yep, that's my baby. Turned 6 this month." "Ah, she's adorable. Always wanted one of my own. Why isn't she here?" Mr. Houston gave a non-direct answer about troubles with the mum, but Officer Ryan knew it was more than that. Forget the badge for a second. This is just a job, man, Officer Ryan said, pointing out his uniform. I'm asking you as a human. I know you don't know me, but it's still just me. Just two dudes talking. No judgment. Tell me about what's going on. Like clockwork, the Barry fucking Ryan effect happened, and Mr. Houston opened up. I listened in silence as the two discussed how Mr. Houston was well aware of his less-than-ideal situation and how he ended up there. After his initial encounter in the forest, the stress became unbearable. He couldn't work. He began drinking heavily, and as a result, his marriage fell to shambles. His decision to hide the truth was born out of fear of ridicule. Even if he was to be believed, he was terrified to introduce anyone to the nightmare world he so desperately wanted to leave. And this combination of unfortunate events landed him where he was now, a place unfit to see his child even in a limited capacity. And maybe he preferred it that way. Perhaps he wanted to be isolated in his own growing darkness. I couldn't help but feel profoundly sorry for him, and to this day I hope he found peace. This was the type of world the chief envisioned when he implored me to keep things secret. A world of fear. From the contemporary evidence, he was absolutely right. Eventually, the conversation returned to Mr. Houston's daughter. Officer Ryan had asked a question that really seemed to strike a chord with him. If the both of us here are saying we believe you, and we're willing to do something, then, as a father, Wouldn't you want to help us make the world a safer place for your daughter?" There was a long silence as he tried to get his thoughts together. He lit another cigarette and nodded. For the next half hour, he went into horrifying detail. While walking through the woods at night, he'd heard a banging noise like someone taking a sledgehammer to a tree. He thought about locating the sound source, but as the sound grew louder and more aggressive, paranoia set in, and he decided to try and leave. He set out in the opposite direction, but didn't get very far before what he said felt like a battering ram knocked him off his feet. In the dark, he couldn't quite see what was standing over him, but he could make out the outline of a lumpy humanoid with a tall head. He didn't get much time to consider just what the hell he was dealing with because, in an instant, it started biting at his flesh and smashing his face in. His only means of survival was to pull out his pistol and fire off a shot into its torso. He heard a loud groan of pain as it staggered backward, and he knew that was his chance and took off into the night. Someone eventually managed to find him on the road, but he passed out on the way to the hospital. When he was fully conscious, he recalled a nurse at his bedside asking what had happened. He contemplated telling her the truth, but ultimately decided against it. From that moment forward, all he'd ever tell anyone was that he simply got attacked by a coyote. Both Officer Ryan and I listened intently as he poured out his trauma. At the end of the conversation, he gave us the location of the forest he was hiking through and the specific trail he took. Lo and behold, it was only a few miles from where Ernie Garrison had been murdered. By the end of the conversation, he was crying and repeating the words, "Never go back. Stay away." Honestly, I wasn't quite sure if it was a message to himself or to us. We stayed with him until he calmed down, doing our best to reassure him that everything would be okay. Eventually, he evened out emotionally enough for us to thank him for his cooperation. As we walked out the door, we assured him we'd do our best to use this information to make the world a safer place for his daughter. Still, he made it a point to stop us at the door and give us some parting words. "I don't know what you boys plan to do, but if you go looking for a nightmare, you're gonna sure as hell find one. And stay safe out there." We nodded in approval and continued on. As we walked to the car, the road to solving this case had become clear. The biggest question that remained was whether we were dealing with a human or something else entirely. But one thing was for sure, we needed to examine those woods. But no sooner had we sat in my car to discuss our next move than a call came through on the radio. Another murder had taken place, this one on the edge of the city line. When the details of the crime and the victims came through on the radio, my heart sunk, and my mind began to falter. A mother and her child were dead, killed as brutally as Mr. Garrison. A deep rage and sadness filled my entire being, and I could just barely find the words to respond, opting for a simple, "On it," over the radio. Without another word, I sped off into the night towards our new destination. So I'm absolutely delighted to be returning to this series. Week or so off, but I was waiting for the author to deliver a new episode, and what episode that was. And as you can probably tell, this one is not finished, not by a long way. So I think we're going to get part 2 of this one, definitely. Enjoying this series? I am, certainly. So thoughts, feelings, anything else in the comment section below the video, and as ever, I'll do my best to respond as many as I can. Well, that's it for one evening. Podcast coming out tomorrow night. What's the theme of the podcast? Oh, body horror, so it's going to be a good one. 2 hours of body horror stories tomorrow night. Then I'll be back here on Friday with a continuation of I'm a Monster, that series I started. Was it last Wednesday? Yeah. I said I'd do the next episodes tonight, but you're going to have to wait till Friday. Well, not too long to wait, is it? So, till next time, my dear friends, sweet dreams and bye-bye. thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.